I've always been fascinated by the cave paintings at the Lascaux Cave Complex in France. There's the obvious wonder at who were these people who were painting on the walls 17,000 years ago, what they must have been like, what they believed, and obviously, why they were making these paintings in the first place. But personally, I'm always struck by how talented they were. How are they better at this than me? Like, I did a video recently that features sketches at the beginning, and for the record, I didn't draw those. I paid a guy, an artist, to draw those based off some mock-ups that I did that look like this. I couldn't draw my way out of a paper bag. And yet these literal cavemen, using charcoal and crushed flowers, living half my lifespan while hunting buffalo to survive with a jaguar tooth lodged in their friggin' skull, were painting these elegant, artistic renderings of horses and bulls and birds with realistic textures and proportions and colors, while upside down in the dark. These guys really cared about what they were drawing and took the time to get all the details just right. This mattered to them. But you know what you won't find at Lascaux Cave or any of the other prehistoric cave paintings for that matter? People. Like, there are stick figures here and there, but they don't have remotely the same level of details that you find in the animals. And even more so, most of them don't have heads or faces. This is actually a bit of an archaeological mystery that's puzzled researchers for decades. Like, all around the world, in all the most ancient art that we find, we never see faces. And at the same time, we know that human beings are like specifically hardwired to recognize and understand faces. This is how we recognize each other. This is how we communicate our emotions. We see faces everywhere. We call it pareidolia. Human beings are all about faces. But for some reason, the depiction of faces is kind of a new phenomenon. But why? And who was the first human face ever recorded? So for this video, I've decided to do something a little bit different. Instead of yammering around the subject for about 20 minutes in an esoteric death spiral, which I know is what you guys came here for, I'm just going to show you right off the bat, because it turns out the first drawing of a face isn't a drawing at all. It's a carving. This is the Venus of Brassempouy. It is all of 1 inch long and made of mammoth ivory, and it's 25,000 years old. Now, I, with my total lack of artistic ability, would imagine that a 3D sculpture of something would be harder to make than a 2D drawing of something, and yet, human figurines have been found all over the place. In fact, there are hundreds of these figurines, some going back way older than the Venus of Brassempouy, like the Venus of Hull Fells, which is 40,000 years old. You might notice this one has a slight case of missing a head. It just kind of has a nub on top. Yeah, whoever was making this was focused on other things. This, by the way, is a fairly common thing in these figurines. Like I said, hundreds of these things have been found, and almost all of them have proportions that would make Sir Mix-a-Lot blush. It's expected that these are fertility totems, named after Venus, the Greek goddess of fertility, and they do look quite fertile. In fact, this is partly why they're considered to be symbolic goddess figures instead of figures of an actual person, because these were made during the Ice Age, so there wasn't a whole lot of food going around. Probably not a lot of people look like this. So it's also thought that maybe it's not a fertility thing, that an image of a well-fed woman symbolizes abundance and survival. I do want to point out that in the Chauvet Cave, which is actually quite a bit older than Lascaux, it's 33,000 years old, there is one image of a human form. It's on a stalactite, and they call it the Venus and the Sorcerer. Venus because it shows the pubic triangle of a woman and her legs. So if you've ever wondered just how far back we've been literally objectifying women, it goes back a minute. But is that fair, though? I mean, why did these early people choose this subject as the only kind of human form they seem to want to depict? And why was it usually in 3D form? Why didn't they have heads? Popular theory is that they just might have had a cultural bias against representing the human form unless it was in mobile representation, like something that could be carried around as a good luck charm or a talisman. Like maybe childbirth is such a risky proposition in humans, it was given to, pregnant women as a way to protect them or ensure a healthy baby. So they allowed it because that was something they could carry around with them. In fact, that might be why they only have little nubs instead of heads. That could have been a place where they could tie a cord around so they could wear it around their necks, which I guess a head could serve that purpose as well, but then it kind of looks like you're strangling someone. So maybe they just did away with the head altogether. One famous exception to the no-head thing is the Venus of Willendorf, which is dated around 30,000 years ago. But even it has like a head that's fully covered by what looks like a basket or a headdress, so still no face. Like that's what you're looking at here. By the way, just to put the time scales in perspective, the time between this and this is longer than the time between today and the pyramids of Giza. And it's 5 times older. Now, there are some other prehistoric sculptures with faces, but they're often animal faces, like the Lion Man of Hohenstein-Stadel. Or if it is a human face, it's usually a very abstract representation, like the Punjab terracotta figure. And just to wrap up this bit about figurines, there are a couple of massive outliers worth talking about. One's called the Venus of Tantan and the Venus of Barakat Ram, which actually go so far back they predate humans. But they are highly debated. But back to the Venus of Brasempouy, what makes this one so different, what makes it stand out from the other Venus figures is that whereas the others didn't have a head, this one is only a head. And it's a very detailed head, which means maybe this is something different. Maybe this was an actual person. It was discovered in 1892 by a French archaeologist named Edouard Piet, and it was found in a cave called the Grotte du Pape near the village of Brasempouy in southwest France. And one of the things that's kind of remarkable about this figure is that it's wearing some kind of hood, which makes this the earliest representations of human clothing as well. In fact, another name for the figure is La Dame à la Capuche, which means the lady with the hood, and I'm sure I did not say that right. It wouldn't be until the 4th millennium BCE that we actually start to finally see realistic faces depicted in human art. And even then, the examples are sparse. So the Venus of Brasempouy stands basically alone as a prehistoric attempt to sculpt a human face. Whoever the artist that made the Venus of Brasempouy was, his or her work is all but unique across 20,000 years of artifacts. And that's weird, right? Especially considering how hardwired we are for faces. I mean, like I said in the beginning, we're totally hardwired to recognize faces everywhere. It's one of the very first things that kids draw when you put a crayon in their hands. They do it horribly, kids are terrible artists, but still. So surely there had to have been some faces in cave paintings. Right? They had the talent for it. They had it for quite some time. There's a cave called Sulawesi in Indonesia. There's paintings of pigs inside that go back 30,000 to 43,000 years ago. And way back then, they showed an understanding of shading and perspective, other artistic techniques. And as I mentioned, the Lascaux caves in France, the reason they became so famous is because the paintings are really good. They show realistic animals in a variety of poses, with several of them pictured in motion. And yet, in all the Lascaux cave images, there is only one image of a human. And it's just like the stick figure guy with a bird-like beak sticking out, getting mauled by a bison. Probably because of his dumb face. Now, there is one cave in Europe that does seem to be the exception to the rule. It's called the La Marche Cave in western France, and there they found bone and stone artifacts that have dated back to what they call the Magdalenian period, roughly 12,000 to 17,000 years ago. But along with those artifacts, they also found portraits on the walls and the floor of the cave. Portraits of men, women, and children alongside the usual animals, but these weren't painted on the rock, they were actually etched into it. The portraits can be kind of hard to interpret because they kind of overlap each other often, but they definitely show faces and portray emotions, like some of them are laughing, some look scared. They aren't what I would call totally realistic, though. They look a lot more like caricatures, like something a modern artist would create. In fact, that's what a lot of experts think they are, just forgeries done by modern artists. Like the clothes that people are wearing are a little bit too much like our clothes. Some of the men appear to be shaved. It doesn't look anything like any other cave art from that time period. There are a lot of red flags. Now, could there have been some way ahead of their time artist that took the cave art world by storm 17,000 years ago? Or wasn't appreciated in their time and spiraled into depression, cut off their ear? Who can say? It's possible. But it's also possible some artistic wanderer came along like way, way later and found the animal carvings and decided to commune with the ancients and add his own, thing to it. A lot can happen in 17,000 years. So La Marche is really interesting, but it's hotly debated. And because of how they were etched, it's kind of hard to actually date the portraits themselves. So we've been talking a lot about ancient Europeans here, but despite what I learned in history class, there were other places in the world. Australia has an impressive rock art that dates back at least 40,000 years, and some of that art does depict faces. But those faces are not human. They're called wandjina, which are rain or cloud spirits with halos around their heads, huge eyes, and no visible mouth. No, we're not doing that. Thank you. No, in this case, we know exactly what they are, and they're not people. Spirit depictions actually are pretty common in Australian Aboriginal art, and this is just one of them. And besides, the wandjina paintings actually aren't that old. They only go back like 4,000 years or so, which is actually roughly when faces started to be painted everywhere else around the world, so the mystery still stands. And I mean, even if you want to count the Lamarche carvings, that's still a massive outlier. The fact of the matter is, faces are still massively underrepresented in ancient cave art. So I don't know, maybe the better question to ask is, why did they paint images in the first place? The people who painted these images were hunter-gatherers. Their entire lives revolved around knowing and understanding the animals around them, which, by the way, massively outnumbered humans at that time. So maybe the paintings are meant to be, like, educational, a way to teach young hunters what animals they eat and what animals eat them. Maybe they used the images to explain hunting tactics so they knew what to do on their first hunts, kind of like a football coach with a whiteboard behind them. They might have held some kind of ritual significance. That was the opinion of the archaeologist Henri Bruel. He proposed that they were a kind of hunting magic, like artists would paint the animals to ensure a successful hunt. There's also the theory that shamans may have used the caves as like visionary temples. Like they would go into a cave full of, whacked out animals on the wall and maybe take a little something to alter themselves a little bit. And then after a while, they'd come out of the cave and tell the rest of the tribe what the animal spirit said to pass on. Or maybe the paintings were all about like telling a story. Grok see thing with horns the other day. No, not bull, horns on nose. You know how it goes. Nobody believes Grok without pictures, so he draws one and bam, he's forever known as Grok the horn spotting guy. Pixar, it didn't happen, even in the Paleolithic. So those are reasons that they might have painted on cave walls: education, ritual, storytelling. So why in that context would they not have painted faces? Well, if education was the reason, if Lascaux was hunting 101 class, then, maybe humans just weren't important. They didn't need to know how to kill a human, so why put it on the wall? By that logic, though, you might assume that if they were talking about, tactics about killing these animals, then you might want to show humans in there to show how to approach from the right angle. You might expect to see human figures, as a bit of a diagram or something like that. But I don't know, maybe simplifying the depictions of humans kept the focus on the animals, which is more important. If the art was ritualistic, if it was hunting magic that ensured animals died on the hunt, then that actually makes a lot of sense why they wouldn't want to put humans on the wall, like that might kill somebody. And the shaman thing, I guess, they wouldn't need to go on a vision quest to commune with humans. They could just talk to them. Although a lot of ancient cultures did believe in communing with their, dead ancestors, which I could see them putting that on the wall. Just saying. As for the storytelling part of it, Grok telling his buddies what happened to him, it's possible that humans just didn't run into other tribes very much back then. There just weren't a lot of us around. Also, a lot of these paintings took place around the Ice Age, so maybe roaming around wasn't really in the cards. Maybe that's why they were stuck in the cave in the first place. By the way, I haven't mentioned so far in this video the hand stencils that you see in caves all around the world. Like, if you want to talk about human cave art, that's kind of the earliest stuff that you'll find. And one theory is that these stencils may have served as a means of communication between different groups, because some of the hands had missing fingers. Archaeologists at first thought that they were missing fingers in real life, like they had been injured or something, but now they think that they may have just like folded the fingers in as a form of sign language. If that's the case, then, maybe the written communication was considered a human touch enough, so, no pictures necessary. But I can't help but find it remarkable that in all that time, in all those cultures, and all those places, that someone wouldn't have just painted a face on a lark, if nothing else. It just feels like such an obvious thing to do. Unless it was enforced in some way. Like, what if it was just culturally taboo to paint people's faces? That would explain why nobody did it, or maybe somebody did it and then it was later removed. Because of the taboo. I mean, there are cultures today that have taboos against depicting people, some of which go back hundreds or even thousands of years. The most famous is the Prophet Muhammad in Islam. Creating his likeness is a big no-no, and they take that very seriously. And you could argue that this is really more of a cultural thing than a religious one, because it isn't actually directly stated in the Quran. What is stated is a rule against worshiping images. And I guess, it stands to reason that if somebody made an image of Muhammad, that people might be tempted to worship it. So they just don't allow it. I can imagine something like this could have existed in the prehistoric world. Like if the shamans considered cave art a type of worship, then they might have been picky about who was depicted. Like animals were one thing. They were gods or spirits or whatever, messengers. But maybe to put humans on that level might be sacrilegious. Going back to Australia, the Aborigines have a taboo about depicting the dead or even saying a dead person's name until after the mourning period's over. And yet journalists in Australia take this very seriously. It's kind of part of their ethics code, so they don't include images of dead Indigenous people in their stories. The point is, a ban on faces is not unheard of, so I could see that as an option, especially in that hunting magic scenario that I talked about before. Like maybe they felt like depicting a human face would bring death to whoever had been drawn, or the artist possibly. Now, there is the possibility that we're just overthinking this. Maybe they didn't have portraits for the same reason they didn't have Iron Age weapons or the wheel or polyester leisure suits. It just hadn't been invented yet. We don't actually start to see realistic human portraits show up until a surprisingly short time ago. And then they just started popping up everywhere. Realistic face carvings start showing up in Mesopotamia around 3300 BCE. Old Kingdom Egyptians started carving faces into statues and reliefs just a little bit after that, but the Egyptian art was highly stylized. It wasn't meant to be an accurate representation. It was more symbolic in nature. The first paintings featuring detailed human faces have been found in China dating back to 1200 BCE. This portrait tradition would later make its way to Rome about 500 years later. But perhaps the most striking examples of early realistic portrait painting comes from the 1st century BCE in Fayum, in what at the time was Roman Egypt. These are what are called mummy portraits. They're images of the dead that were placed over their bodies in the tombs, and about 900 of these have been found so far. Unlike the earlier Egyptian art that was usually in profile and very formal, the Fayum portraits are face-on, personal, and about as close to a glamour shot as you could get in the ancient world. No expense was spared in the making of these portraits. Like, real gold leaf was used to depict jewelry. But the images are also really down to earth and vulnerable and refreshingly honest about middle-aged hairlines. These images are not a symbolic representation of some spirit or king. When you look at these images, you are looking at a person. You can imagine crossing eyes with them at the market. You could have ordered tea from that guy, watched her sing a song, asked her where she got those earrings. They look like someone you might see today. In fact, here's a picture of a modern Egyptian man standing next to one of the portraits. That's kind of freaky. And we know exactly who these people are because their names were on them, and their bodies were beneath them. So if the question we're asking here is who were the first humans whose faces you could look at today, it might be these people. They had names like Artemidius, Deimos, and Hermione, which are Greek in origin, but they actually paint quite an interesting picture of what a melting pot Egypt was at the time. They featured Pharaonic Greek and Roman styles all kind of mixed together. These faces are kind of an immortality for these people. We still get to see them 2,000 years later. Of course, realistic visualizations of the human face became a lot more normal after that, and then once photography came along, we all saw our own faces all the time. Today we look at our own faces constantly, on our phones and social media and mirrors, but that is not the norm throughout history. In fact, maybe we're asking the wrong question. Maybe the mystery isn't, why they didn't paint faces, but why are we so obsessed with them? Not to say that people in the past had no idea what they looked like. They saw themselves in, pools of water. They polished metal to see their reflections. Glass mirrors showed up about 2,000 years ago, about the same time as the Fayum portraits, which is kind of interesting. But there's no question that in the long span of human history, we see our own faces far more than ever before. How many selfies do you think get taken every day? We went from creating no realistic depictions of the human face for hundreds of thousands of years to, today probably there's a face somewhere created in the world every second. Hell, probably every millisecond. So yeah, maybe we're the weird ones. But as to the question of who was the first human being to ever have their face recorded, I'm going to go with the Venus of Brassempouy. I do. I think this was an actual person. It's just so different from everything else from that period. It's wearing a hood. It's got a specific piece of clothing on. I think the person that made this was trying to make it look like another person. A woman who was really important to them. A mother, the memory of whose warm smile was a source of comfort. A lover or a wife that they couldn't imagine living without until they had to. Or a daughter who he missed while he was on a long hunt. I like to think that out there in the great span of human history, there was a woman who left such an impression on someone that they had to put stone to tusk to honor her. That there was some unknown person all the way back then whose very humanity was so powerful that her likeness lives on 25,000 years later. I like that. Of course, they do think that the head broke off of something else, so if she did have a body and it was like everything else from that period, she had giant
2 days later.
Question. Have you ever recorded a whole ass YouTube video and then found out a couple days later that it was totally wrong? Because I did. Not that everything in this video is wrong. Everything still stands. There's nothing really incorrect about it. But after I recorded this, I stumbled across a story of another human head that was carved that is actually a much better candidate for the oldest human face ever recorded. It was this little lady right here. This is 26,000 years old. It was sculpted from mammoth ivory, like the Bresson-Boy one. But the difference between this one and the Venus of Bresson-Boy that I was talking about was that this one, they actually know who this is. Like the Bresson-Boy one, I do think was a real person, but we don't really know who this person was. It's all kind of speculative. They know who this person was because it was buried with this person's body. And this is actually really interesting. So to move over to Wikipedia, this was found at a place called Dolní Věstonice. Dolní Věstonice. It's a whole site that was actually discovered in the 1920s. There's a lot of burial things there. I'll get to that in just a second. But it was found in the 1920s. It was kind of like re-excavated in the last like 30 years or so. And they found this figurine. By the way, this is located in the South Moravian region of the Czech Republic. So there's lots of things that they found there, including another traditional Venus statue with all the attributes that one would expect from a Venus statue. There was also this famous burial that had 3 individuals in it that were buried in a way that is unfortunate. But this particular woman who was buried with this figurine was in her 40s. That's kind of actually up there in age for that time. And the thing about it that's fascinating is when you pull it up big, it kind of has the left side of the figurine is a little bit different from the right. They talk about how it's got a little bit of a scar there on the left eye. Well, they know that it came from the particular person that was buried in that same spot because the skull had a deformity in its left eye. And here they've created a recreation sort of based off of the skull of what this person might have looked like, and they have the hair pulled up in the way that it was on the statuette there. And by the way, if that skull looks a bit red skullish, a little marvelish, it's because it was buried in red ochre, which apparently is something that they did for like shamans back in the day. So they think that this woman might have been a shaman or some kind of religious figure. And it says right here that actually that was something that was pretty common back then. It says it was not uncommon that people with disabilities, either mental or physical, were thought to have unusual supernatural powers. So it wasn't unusual for somebody with a slight deformity to be a shaman. So when I say that we know exactly who this person is, it wasn't like a historical figure and we know who this person is and what they, achieved or whatever. We don't know this person's name, but there was an actual physical body that accompanied this figurine that was very clearly the same person. So while I can speculate all day long that the Venus of Bresson-Boy was based off of a real person, there is absolutely no doubt that this was based on a real person. And it's like 1,000 years older than the Venus of Bresson-Boy. So this is the actual answer of the oldest human face that was ever recorded. Unless, if you really, really, really want to stretch the definition of the oldest human face ever recorded, there was something that happened in June, literally just a few months ago, that's worth talking about. Because it might be this guy. So there was a site in Morocco called the Jebel Irhoud. Jebel Irhoud? I'm probably saying it wrong. There was a site in Morocco where some remains were found that were 300,000 years old. So this is a modern human dating back to 300,000 years ago, which really pushes the upper limit of what a human being was. And it also challenges the notion of when we thought that people were migrating out of Africa. So this was actually found a few years ago. The skull was not all in one piece. It was a bit, fractured. So they pieced it back together, did a digital thing. And this artist in Spain did some computer bibbidi-bobbidi-boo and was able to reconstruct it as this guy. So this is not only the earliest man that we know of that qualifies as a Homo sapien for reasons that the scientists came up with, but they were able to sort of recreate what he might have looked like. Now, is this perfect? No. Did he actually look like that? Yeah, we don't know. And does this stretch the definition of what I'm doing in this video? 1,000%, because this was not made 300,000 years ago. It was made today, but it is the possible face of somebody who existed 300,000 years ago. It's going to be really hard to top that. But anyway, I ran across that like right after I recorded the video, and I was like, okay, I have to include it. I have to talk about it. So there you go. So like I was saying, today we are just awash in human faces. I mean, you're looking at one right now. Or are you? Generative AI has made it so that we can be awash in images of faces that aren't even real, but look real. Or real faces doing things that they never actually did. So it's actually becoming harder and harder to differentiate between fact and fiction. Where once communication was limited to just hand signals on cave walls, today we have so much of it and so many opinions and biases around it that we kind of actually need tools to figure out what to believe. And for my money, the best tool at our disposal is Ground News. Ground News is a website and app that aggregates over 50,000 news outlets from around the world and arranges them by story. And it was actually developed by a former NASA engineer who worked on the Webb telescope. Every story on Ground News comes with a visual breakdown of the reporting bias, readability, and ownership, all backed by ratings by 3 independent news monitoring organizations. For example, here's a story about AI industry CEOs meeting with the Biden administration recently. Right away, you'll see the coverage details, which shows you how many outlets have reported on this story. And below that, you can see that most of the reporting for the story came from left-leaning news outlets. They also show useful factuality and ownership charts. Then you can go down the list of specific articles, and as you can see, each article has these same bias ratings at the individual level. I especially like to look at the ownership rating because, they always say follow the money. Well, here's the money. What I like to say about Ground News is that it gives you more information about your information, but it can also open you up to what the other side might be thinking. That's why I appreciate their blind spot feed, which highlights stories that are being underreported by the left or the right. And even if you don't agree with some of these blind spots, at least it gives you an idea of what kind of information the other side is getting or not getting. Ground News has become the place I go to whenever news stories break to see things that maybe don't pop up in my own media bubble. And I, for one, think it's a game changer. In fact, I think this is the future of news consumption. Or at least I hope it is. It really is an amazing tool. I recommend it to friends and family in real life, and now I'm recommending it to you because if you go to groundnews.com/joescott, you can get 40% off their Vantage subscription, which is what I use for unlimited access to all their incredible features. So if you've never checked it out, it's definitely worth a look. And 40% off is nothing to sneer at. It's a good deal, it's a good service. Links down below. Or just scan this here QR code to get started. All right, thank you guys so much for watching. Real quick shout out to all of the channel members and supporters over on Patreon, all the cool kids. If you would like to join them, get early access to videos, access to exclusive live streams and Zoom calls, and an exclusive members-only server on Discord, just go to patreon.com/answerswithjoe or just click the little join now button down below. That'll make you a channel member. Either way, you get to do cool stuff and join a really cool group of people. And if this is your first time here, thank you so much for joining. I hope you enjoyed this video. Here's a video, if you like that one, here's a video about the Silurian hypothesis. If you've ever heard of that one, it's the idea that maybe way, way, way back in history, there could have been a reptilian intelligent civilization around. It's one of my favorite ones. People tend to like it. But you can check that one out or look at any of the others on the side over here that have my face and my name on them. Give them a look, and if you enjoy them, I do invite you to subscribe because I come back in videos every Monday. But that's it for today. You guys go out there, have an eye-opening rest of the week. Stay safe, and I'll see you next Monday. Love you guys. Take care.